Video games have had bosses since the beginning. Bosses are intrinsically tied to video games like story arcs are tied to scripts. They're a foundational element that's also changed a lot over the years. We're starting way back from the beginning and taking you through the roller coaster that is the history of video game bosses, from the early days to the dark ages in the early 2000s. Video games and bosses are like peanut butter and jelly, but the story is a lot more complicated than that. So buckle up, kids. We got an extra long video for you today. Hope you got some time on your hands. We're rewinding the clock first back to 1974 with D&D. This is so old, it's pre-Nintendo, pre-Atari, and pre-animated graphics. It's also the first game with a recognizable video game boss, technically. In D&D, which is actually named after the file name, you move a tiny hero through barely comprehensible dungeon floors to level up. It's a very basic game coded on a very old computer that was clearly never meant for video games. But the boss waiting at the end of your journey is a tiny little image of a dragon. There are many ways to define a video game boss, and we think a powerful enemy at the end of the level counts. This definitely counts here. D&D gets points for introducing the boss-like concept to the world of video games. But tough endgame enemies wouldn't actually technically be called bosses until Galaxian. Next here in 1979. This game added boss to the video game dictionary. Fighting through waves of enemy spaceships leads to this encounter with a tougher enemy called the boss Galaxian. This boss Galaxian guy doesn't have a health bar, and it doesn't appear at the end of the game, but it is tougher than your average alien enemy, and it gets you bonus points for shooting it down. The flagships are at the top of the Space Invaders fleets, and once you clear enough ships, they'll fly straight down at you with an escort. There are multiple of these quote-unquote bosses per wave, so it doesn't exactly fit the definition of a true video game boss. But now we gotta jump far ahead again to something that's a lot closer to what we all imagine. 1985, Super Mario Brothers. Ask anyone in the world to name a video game character. They're probably gonna think of Mario first. The Mario Brothers are the original video game icons. Obviously, they popularized so many aspects of video game design, we can't really discuss it all here because we're all about the bosses specifically. Now, King Koopa here blocks Mario's path at the end of the castle stage. Instead of fighting him directly, Mario must jump over Koopa's head and hit the axe, cutting the bridge and dumping the lizard into the lava, of course. Koopa, or Bowser in future games, is one of the best examples of a true video game boss fight. No matter what trends were running through the video game industry, Nintendo kept plugging along and sticking Bowser in video games with boss fights, where you have more challenge. You gotta do something a little bit differently. You gotta figure out a trick. Bowser has been around for like the last 40 years, and boss fights have only become more popular. Bowser gave us our first major, memorable video game boss character. He isn't just an obstacle at the end of the stage, he's like an eternal video game nemesis, and frankly, we love him for that. Now, jumping to 1986, Dragon Warrior. This added another important wrinkle to the boss formula. So bosses have multiple forms and can be difficult, like really difficult. A brief encounter with a Galaxian flagship we mentioned, or dropping Koopa into a lava, wasn't enough in 1986, so Dragon Warrior made the Dragon Lord into this epic encounter that really tested all the skills that you've learned, and it sets up future rhythms of JRPG battles. This is a boss that requires a lot of patience and a lot of level grinding to beat. By today's standards, it's basic. It's essentially two JPEGs that flash at you while numbers go up and down. It's also the template that all future Dragon Quest games would use going forward, and Dragon Quest is the inspiration for basically every JRPG. Jumping ahead 1 year later, 1987, Mega Man hit the pavement running with an innovative change to boss fights. Mega Man gave you choices, dude. You were presented with a menu of bosses, and you can take them out however you want, in whatever order. Each boss drops a different weapon upgrade for Mega Man, and each boss has a specific weakness you can exploit. So taking out Guts Man so you can destroy Cut Man, then Electric Man, and then Fire Man and Ice Man, it makes it all feel like you're just super smart. You're figuring these guys out. It's a really fun mechanic that feels really ahead of its time, and it's one of the most copied tricks in video games now. There are hundreds of indie platformers that still use this system because it works. Now, that same year, 1987, we got R-Type, which is a prototypical example of a shoot 'em up. The shmup genre is something we're not really familiar enough with, but these games have been chugging along for decades, and they're not going to stop anytime soon. R-Type has one of the most iconic first video game bosses in history. This weird flesh monster that will become the standard enemy type for a whole lot of future shooters. It's an early inspiration that we didn't want to skip. Now jumping to 1991 with Street Fighter 2. Look, the 90s introduced a lot of new ways to play video games, and those genre shifts gave us new ways to fight big bosses. And Street Fighter 2 popularized fighting games, obviously, like they really brought them to the mainstream because they were good. And it also popularized the fighting game boss. It's easy to forget, but the original Street Fighter 2 had 4 CPU-only bosses we couldn't play as. Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison are foundational characters in the series now, but back then, they were just bosses, and M. Bison has become the quintessential fighting game big boss at the end. Like, he's a giant with psychic powers, and he just munches through your coins at the arcade. That was a perfect boss, so like, what else needs to be said? Now, over in 1992, Wolfenstein 3D, because computers were getting pretty good at showing off arcade action from a different perspective, and this game is burned into our brains because of an early game boss fight. Not only just the perspective, which was revolutionary, but after a few levels of walking around these maze-like rooms and shooting guards, you'll face off against a mech man called Hans Gross. He's representative of everything a first-person shooter boss is, really. Like, he's a giant tank you shoot at a lot until it explodes. He's the template for a lot of boomer shooters. Sure, future games would add phases and faster movement and strafing and parry mechanics, but they're all essentially Hans Gross here. This boss is just hilariously primitive because game designers were just really excited to be in like a fake 3D environment then. They hadn't thought about implementing actual complex gameplay. We'd have to wait a little bit longer for that. Okay. 1993, Doom. The first-person shooter genre exploded when Doom dropped in 93, and the bosses became a lot better. At least one boss became so much better. The Cyber Demon is like as iconic as video game bosses get. Instead of having a big hit-scanning enemy with bullets you can't possibly dodge, the Cyber Demon would fire deadly rockets. They were fast, but they could be dodged back then. The presentation is a big step up too, man. Like, when you see this boss, this is a boss. The Cyber Demon roars when you enter the arena, and its mechanical stomps, that old school sound, is still intimidating. This isn't like a first attempt like Hans Gross, but it's far better as a boss in feel and gameplay. And video games were only gonna get better at presenting big, over-the-top, powerful enemies. 1994, Super Metroid, Mother Brain. It's a boss we've talked about plenty of times here on gameranx because it represents a really big shift in the way bosses were experienced by players, right? It's a lesson other game developers didn't truly run with for decades either. Super Metroid introduced the cinematic boss battle. At the end of the story, Samus Aran has infiltrated the alien planet. She's defeated all these Metroids. She's rescued one baby Metroid that's now fully grown. Now, after fighting Mother Brain in her big glass tube in a nostalgic, even back then, remake of the original Metroid NES final boss, Mother Brain here breaks free and mutates into this giant monster. So we have different forms, full animation, and finally, like a cinematic angle when Mother Brain corners Samus with a powerful beam that drains your health. It looks like you've lost, you feel like you're down and out, but then the friendly Metroid returns to interrupt Mother Brain, takes its power, and then it gives it to you, to Samus. Now, you've got the most powerful weapon in the game. It's a fight that you take part in. You can die if you make mistakes, but it's secretly like a roller coaster ride. It doesn't need a single text box to even explain itself. Nothing. No tutorial. This is one huge step forward for video game bosses. It was a huge, triumphant, fun moment. Something must have been in the air too, because another iconic boss fight appeared that same year. 1994's Earthbound. The battle against Gigas in Earthbound is a lot like the Mother Brain fight in Super Metroid. Like, both of these battles trick the player into thinking they're in far more danger than they really are. Look, they make it like the odds look impossible, but you can overcome anyway. In Earthbound, the story ends with your heroes traveling in time to battle this extra-dimensional entity here. In the final battle, you're just overwhelmed with these deadly attacks. You can't actually harm Gigas with any of your normal options. Instead, you have to use the Pray command. It's part puzzle and part cinematic. It uses the mechanics of a boss to tell a story. It's a trick that future games like Undertale and Deltarune really expanded on. And like Super Metroid, this is another early innovation that we love to see. And it's kind of like the drama that's totally unique to video games. Jumping to 1997, Final Fantasy VII. This is like the elephant in the room we can't ignore. We'd love to talk about our favorite game in this series, for some of us, Final Fantasy VI, but look, if we're talking about the evolution of boss fights, we have to talk about Sephiroth. Final Fantasy VII made JRPGs into big international business thanks to flashy cinematics and impressive graphics using Hollywood quality computers to do things that our little 90s brains just couldn't even comprehend. And one of those things that we just couldn't comprehend was Sephiroth's final form in FF7. The one-winged angel boss fight is bombastic in a way that we had not seen before. It was also brutally difficult if you weren't fully prepared. So he's like bathed in this holy light and he descends from the sky to a booming chorus. It's insane. That theme is drilled into our brains. Back then, the collective gamer consciousness couldn't handle something this intimidating. It doesn't look like much today, obviously, super humble, super stupid. But back then, the introduction of Safer Sephiroth, it just melted brains and rewired us to always expect final bosses to be this epic. It made gamers demand more. It made such a big impact. Square Enix is still trying to capture a fraction of this hype for its Final Fantasy VII Remake series. And again at 1997, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, because right now we're in the middle of the golden age for bosses. Look no further than Castlevania Symphony of the Night to see exactly why. Like, who cares about quality when you can have quantity here? There are so many good bosses in Symphony, it's hard to narrow down and focus on just a few of the iconic ones. Granfaloon is one of the most bizarre bosses in video game history, with like a giant orb of featureless bodies surrounding an alien gross creature at the center, or the massive Beelzebub, this corpse that summons flies and forces you to dismantle the body one part at a time. These are all impressive as hell bosses. But the fake final boss is the evolution we need to really talk about here. The idea of extending a game by discovering a quote-unquote true path, it wasn't new in 97, but it's rarely done better than in Symphony here. By going on a series of secret quests and exploring every corner of Dracula's castle, it's actually possible to reveal the secret power controlling Richter, saving him, and then unlocking an entire kind of new castle to explore, the Inverted Castle. If you don't know, this is a legendary unlock in video games, and it's an opportunity to throw even more bosses into a game that's already brimming with weird, unique creatures. Symphony of the Night is boss fight heaven, and Konami would milk the format for years and years on all different handheld systems. Moving up a year to 1998, Metal Gear Solid. Look, it's me, Jake, talking in a video, so I had to bring up my favorite game. Look, this game is an evolution and a total anomaly, because Nobody really else did it like Konami and Hideo Kojima back then. Metal Gear Solid on PS1 was cinematic in a way that video games just were not. There are too many good bosses to talk about here, and future Metal Gear games are famously just full of good, creative, weird boss fights, but we'll stick with the most obvious standout, the one that really started it all, and once again led players to really think differently about these types of battles. Psycho Mantis. It's a boss that plays with your expectations and breaks the fourth wall. He reads your memory card and comments on the saved game content you have on there.
There's no need for words, Snake. I'm Psycho Mantis! That's right. This is no trick. It's true power. It's useless, I told you. I can read your every thought.
Very explicitly reads your inputs to dodge your attacks. To beat him, you have to literally unplug your controller and plug it into a different controller slot on the PS1 to trick and surpass his mind-reading capabilities. For modern audiences, we have to like swap the slot through a menu, but it still works the same way.
Why? Why couldn't I read your mind?
Look, back then, that was freaking crazy. It's the kind of out-of-the-box experience that these Metal Gear games are always really interested in. There are plenty of Metal Gear ripoffs and homages, but very rarely do developers actually try to copy the creativity on display with this type of boss battle. Also in 1998, very quickly, let's talk about Ganon in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. This game is following the same trajectory as Metal Gear and Final Fantasy VII, really just upping the production value, presentation, and cinematic nature, making bosses feel like this big moment, a big dramatic scene, and more impressive in like every way. I mean, think about it, like the blasted ruins where Link fights a dark, frighteningly demonic Ganon makes this feel like the first Legend of Zelda for older kids. Compared to the cutesy pig monster from the last games, this Ganon is actually an intimidating bad guy dude. It's a big finale for the biggest game of the Nintendo 64 era. Also in 1998, man, what a year. I was eating good. We all were. Resident Evil 2. Capcom evolved video game bosses by making them impossible to kill, kinda. Before Nemesis in 3, there was Mr. X here in Resident Evil 2, this trench coat wearing tyrant that only appeared on a particular playthrough. This lumbering menace appeared at specific points in the game to hunt you down, and he would punch through walls and appear when you'd least expect it. All these encounters culminate in a final showdown against its fully powered form, and there's a lot of catharsis in finally putting this guy down, because he hunts you through the game and he feels like this unkillable force. It was so good. And the future was bright for Capcom too, because future versions of Mr. X are even more innovative. Mr. X and Nemesis exist on the same awesome wavelength of boss fight evolution. In 1998, man, you had to be there. Now, jumping ahead to 2001, Devil May Cry. Capcom here took a canceled game and spun gold with this. Turning Resident Evil into like the combo heavy and stylish Devil May Cry series seemed like it could have been a fluke, but it's hard to overstate how influential this game really is. The combat at the time blew my little mind. We wouldn't have an entire run of top-tier platinum games if it wasn't for Devil May Cry, and you'll get everything you need up to the very first boss. The giant spider isn't the most creative boss, but it isn't the design that matters here. Devil May Cry made character action games into a much bigger thing, all about the fast, fluid movement and building your combo with stylish strings of attacks. Devil May Cry demands precision and like combo precision, and it rewards you for pulling it off. Future games in the series would truly get the balance down right, but Devil May Cry got the ball rolling, and some of those boss battles are incredible. From the music to the camera perspective shifts, it was something special. Jumping to 2002, you're probably wondering why we're wasting time talking about this forgotten military shooter here, Soldier of Fortune 2 Double Helix. Well, we have to stop the fun talk to talk about a very different trend in the evolution of boss fights. The helicopter boss, man. This staple of like the military genre and like shooters is still going strong today. I mean, Black Ops 7 is still doing lame helicopter boss fights in 2025. And Soldier of Fortune 2 just happens to be the best example for 2002, man. First-person shooter games love just sending a big helicopter to hunt you. There are way too many examples of this trope to count them all, but the worst offenders are straight up boring. The helicopter hovers, strafes you, sometimes shooting missiles while your guy hides in a corner somewhere, very slowly plinking away at the boss's health. It's no wonder gamers in the mid-2000s really just started to get pissed off at boss fights. We haven't truly entered the dark ages of boss fights yet, but this early example of bad boss fights is a dark omen for a kind of bleak future. Jumping to 2004 with Halo 2. Western developers just couldn't wrap their heads around good boss fights. And for proof of that, look at the extremely underwhelming final encounter in Halo 2, where Master Chief must battle a Yeti man with a hammer. Yes, look, Halo 2 is classic for a reason, but the final boss fight feels a bit like an afterthought. And that's because boss fights in a lot of games then were an afterthought. Development was getting more difficult and longer for video games. Game mechanics were getting simpler to focus more on presentation, and then the boss fights kind of suffered. There's no strategy to the brute battle in Halo 2. You just shoot him until he dies. You might need to run away briefly to recharge your shields, but that's really all there is. Halo 2 was one of the biggest and best games of 2004, don't get it twisted, so we can't ignore how it didn't try to engage with the idea of a boss fight. By this time, most first-person shooter developers were skipping a lot of boss fights. They didn't have to be this bad, but if they were, we prefer cutting them. Sticking with 2004, our bias is showing here, but it's Metal Gear Solid 3. Look, lead it to this type of game to ruin all of our little theories about the evolution of video game bosses and the trajectory. Really, video game bosses weren't truly, suffering or really kind of getting unmemorable until the Xbox 360 era. The PS2 was still churning out these amazing boss battles, and Metal Gear Solid, of course, was the outlier. Nobody was really doing what these games did, and there are some amazing boss fights to talk about in 3. Probably the most iconic is the grueling sniper duel against the End, where your stealthy Snake must use every tool in his arsenal to spot and counter this sniper hidden in a really large jungle. The fight can actually be played really slow. It can take literal hours to win. And hilariously, you can actually wait a week of in-game time to make the boss just die of old age. See, look, that's weird. Nobody else did stuff like that. It isn't the only boss that matters. The end of Metal Gear Solid 3 is a gauntlet of dramatic boss fights against the over-the-top evil Volgin. This giant robotic tank.
We're wearing him down.
I can't move! What?
There. Do that again.
Die!
And a hand-to-hand stealth battle against your mentor, the boss. Look, they're all contenders for some of the best video game boss fights ever, but they're also just separate from wider video game trends. Games were becoming more streamlined, and bosses were too complicated, I guess, to make overly complex, but here, it wasn't even about that. They were good, fun boss battles that were engaging, but also they sold the emotion, the build-up to a big dramatic fight. The Metal Gear games, look, I could just quit gameranx tomorrow and just make a Metal Gear Solid channel, but anyway.
I'm disappointed. Try. Pathetic. Time to play rough.
Let's move on to 2005's God of War. Western developers weren't completely outclassed in the boss fight department thanks to games like this. The original God of War here turned boss fights into spectacles that really pushed like every ounce of power that the PS2 could provide. The first battle against the Hydra is still impressive today. You're caught in the middle of this raging storm, battling a monster with multiple heads, all this stuff's going on around you. It's just sublime chaos. This isn't the stylish combat of Devil May Cry. This is video game as like cinematic chaos. And the future God of War games would push those limits. God of War 2 is a huge step up in terms of raw gameplay, but we gotta give props to the one that started it all, because the original God of War had some kick-ass boss fights. Now, over at 2005, we could spend all day talking about the bosses of Resident Evil 4 here. The original game has so much stuff, man. Enemies, weapons, bosses, weird level locations. Capcom couldn't fit it all into a remake that's roughly twice as long as the original. Look, every few steps of OG Resident Evil 4 introduces something new. The plotting, slow boss fights of earlier Resident Evil games have been replaced with kinetic action set pieces where you'll actually have to fight desperately to survive. Resident Evil 4 slowly shifts as you play from survival horror into like full-on action movie schlock in its final chapters, and nothing exemplifies that better than the Krauser knife fight. Krauser is an absurd pastiche of American military movie guys. He's this shirtless commando with the John Rambo's explosive bow, Arnold Schwarzenegger's physique. In the last act of the game, Krauser appears in this ruin, and you have to do a showdown with him. And he throws everything he's got at you. He shoots from cover, he does cool flips into melee combat with a knife, and then he retreats with flash grenades. It's a multi-stage, kind of slow-paced boss fight that can explode into QuickTime events at any moment. It all ends with a tight time limit where you'll have to beat Krauser and escape before bombs go off that kill you both. He grows a monster Resident Evil style arm, but then becomes extremely vulnerable to your basic knife attack. So it's an exhilarating battle, and mechanically, from a gameplay perspective, engaging. it's one of the best in the Resident Evil series. It's so bombastic, so intricate and involved that Capcom didn't even try to match it until the Resident Evil 4 remake, almost 2 decades later, and I think they did a good job with that.
I'm not surprised you made it this far. Not bad. I didn't expect anything less. After all, I'm better than anyone. It's a damn shame you can't see the truth.
2005 is the year of anomalies because Shadow of the Colossus is a video game that's all about bosses. It's just one big boss after another. Each Colossus here is kind of like a puzzle to solve and a battle to overcome. It's a very modern kind of game that cuts out almost all the fat. There is no filler in this game. The first Colossus is a classic example of this complex, interesting type boss fight. It's all about kind of prodding for weaknesses, some exploration, and then finally catharsis when you stab the giant for the last time. That first Colossus is a great example of storytelling as gameplay. It's also a game that's so blatantly uncommercial, it's very difficult to copy, so nobody would. It's an undeniable influence on modern boss design in so many video games, and it's also a blip on the radar. Shadow of the Colossus is like the planted seed of a great tree that won't grow for many, many years, because after 2005, we kind of entered the boss fight dark ages. Fast forward to 2008 with Gears of War 2. The Xbox 360 era was a great time for video games, and kind of a rough time for boss fights, man. It was bad. Maybe bosses were just too video gamey or easy. Maybe games were getting too simplified and streamlined. Maybe developers were just sick of working on bosses. I don't know. But Gears of War 1 has some truly pathetic boss encounters. The final boss fight against General Ram is like the most frustrating, kind of pointless, no strategy type of fight. It was so rough, the developers didn't even bother putting a final boss in Gears of War 2, which is arguably the best game in the series. It still managed to end on a whimper. The final boss was like a lame turret sequence where your soldiers shoot a stationary monster for like 5 seconds and then that's it. Gears of War is hardly the nadir of boss fights. Like Gears 2 has multiple fun bosses, but it's also yet another AAA Western developer giving up at the finish line. A lot of games in this time period just couldn't quite stick the landing. And as we move forward here, there's a lot of other examples. Like we're in the boss fight dark ages now, so let's move on to 2009. Batman Arkham Asylum. It's like one of our favorite video games of all time, even if the bosses basically suck. There are awesome, incredible sequences here, though. You know, the encounter against Scarecrow in a surprise fear gas hallucination is awesome. A frightening escape from Killer Croc is another highlight. But those aren't really bosses. The first true boss of Batman is Bane, and he follows another familiar trend. There are video game helicopters, like we mentioned earlier, and then there are big video game bad guys that run at you. They do a big charge, and then they crash into walls. Bane is the second thing, and Arkham is packed with this type of dumb enemy down to the end. Arkham Asylum let us down with its bosses, but at least Arkham City tried a little harder. Again, 2009 also with the Bionic Commando remake. We can't talk about the dark ages of boss fights without talking about the worst trend ever for a lot of people. QuickTime events. Specifically, bosses based all around QuickTime events are kind of the scourge of video game endings because they're not as interactive. I personally kind of don't mind QTEs. I know that's a pretty hot take, but for a lot of people, they're nowhere near as engaging as a real boss fight would be. To a lot of people, it's the lowest of the low. Like, instead of giving us like even a cursory gameplay ending, you're just thrown into a cutscene with buttons flashing on screen for you to make things happen. Bionic Commando is one of the worst examples of this practice. You know, the game builds up an encounter with your former boss and an army of these cool, unstoppable robots, and then they diffuse it all with a 30-second cutscene of your commando beating up the guy in the mech suit. It's lame. And a lot of games are guilty of doing it this exact way. Now, before we move on, let's talk about Warhammer 40k Space Marine, the original. This game on Xbox 360 also ended with a supremely lame QuickTime event fight against a Chaos Prince. That was 2 years later, in 2011, and if you need a light at the end of the video game boss tunnel, then just fast forward to look at the Space Marine 2 to see how much modern video game bosses have changed. Instead of a QuickTime event boss, Space Marine 2 features a full-on epic encounter against the main villain where you'll have to use all your shooting and melee skills to bring him down. It's an encounter that's actually worthy of something good, and it's the perfect lens to view the late 2000s, because boss fights were very bad, but they're gonna get a lot better. Jumping over to 2011 with Dark Souls. It's difficult to overstate the impact of this one, and Demon Souls really laid the groundwork for Dark Souls and influenced 1,000 developers to push the boundaries of what video games really expect or demand from players, right? Like, there have always been hardcore video games, difficult simulations that demand total commitment. You know, challenge was always out there in the video game world, but Dark Souls figured out the right mixture of risk and reward that makes this one of the most copied video game formats of all time now. The bosses are a big reason why this game is still so fondly remembered, because Dark Souls broke all the rules. The infamous fight against Ornstein and Small, a pair of knights with very different fighting styles, was like running headfirst into a brick wall in 2011. Video games were never this cruel. One was fast while the other was slow and powerful, and defeating one powered up the other, just making the fight even more difficult. This fight is often imitated even by future FromSoft games, but this is still like one of the meanest examples. If you've played all these games to death, by today's standards, they may not be that bad if you're like an Elden Ring veteran, but still. The only reason we can say that now is because this type of boss fight has been endlessly remixed, copied, and improved upon. Dark Souls really popularized this type of combat and this type of boss. The smallest single developer game studios to the biggest, like EA, liberally borrow concepts from Dark Souls and stuff. It takes a few years, but video game boss fights are about to get a whole lot better and a whole lot harder because the kid gloves are off. Because sticking with 2011, we also had Batman Arkham City, which upped its boss battle game across the board. But the best of the bunch has to be Mr. Freeze, the most talked about example. It's a unique twist on a traditional boss battle that forces Batman to use all his skills, specifically stealth, striking at Mr. Freeze from different angles. But depending on how you attack, Freeze counters by summoning drones or destroying gargoyles, basically taking out all of your tricks. You can only use every trick you have in your arsenal once. You have to think differently. The fight changes completely based on your playstyle, and it tests your knowledge of all the things Batman can do, how he can perform a takedown. It may not be the hardest ever, but it's definitely one of the more creative boss fights in the series because it asks you to use your sneaking skills in a novel, interesting way. You gotta use all of Batman's tools here, and that's awesome. Jumping to 2013, leading directly from Arkham City, Last of Us has its own stealth boss battle against a cannibalistic madman that's hunting down Ellie. Trapped in a burning restaurant during this fierce snowstorm, the fire is slowly spreading around the building as this guy searches for you. Now, you're playing as Ellie for a small period of time, right? Like, she can't fight and brawl balls out like Joel can. She's not heavy duty, right? So she has to strike from shadows with her pocket knife. And it's a pretty tense moment that shows how to create a cinematic boss fight. The bad guy doesn't need a freeze ray or a giant gun to be an overwhelming threat here, and you don't need a million tools. It can be as simple as just trying to sneak up on a bad guy and stab him in the back, but when you have all the good tension building, the dramatic stuff, the presentation here, it can really hit. Jumping over to the 2015 Undertale. Indie games really elevated the boss battle to an art form here. This was a quirky little light RPG with silly characters and a unique combat mechanic. Instead of fighting monsters, each battle is actually a puzzle where you make the right choices and win by making friends. But what happens when you fight something that won't give up? Well, Flowey is the first final boss of Undertale, and it's a shock to the system. The art style completely changes to something far more bizarre. The tiny pixel flower turning into this collage of low-quality photos that unleashes a barrage of attacks that just seem impossible to dodge. Now, if you remember what we talked about earlier, Earthbound and Super Metroid, this is a fight that's both a test of skill and a big old trick on the player. Like, you're actually a lot safer than you think you are, with the game secretly giving you extra chances to survive. It's an incredible fight that makes you feel overwhelmed and barely hanging on. That's a good feeling here. That's the essence of a good boss fight, and part of the magic trick that the game pulls on us here. You're always meant to win in this, even if the battle looks unwinnable. That's how they sold it. And again in 2015, we gotta talk about Yakuza, because this is another video game series that chugged along outside the mainstream, giving us a real steady stream of extremely hype boss battles. What makes Yakuza different is the way the series never really changed. It becomes smoother, less stiff, and a little flashier, but the essence of the brawls didn't change for a long time. The series really hit a stride, we think, in Yakuza 0. Where a young Kiryu faces off against his gangster allies. Kuze is one of our favorites. He's this madman that clashes with Kiryu in the sewers, riding a motorcycle while shirtless and swinging a pipe like a katana. The series is full of absurd fights like this that somehow still feel real enough in their own little worlds. The series continues to deliver in 2025, and it doesn't look like they're letting up anytime soon. It's hardly part of the larger canon of boss fights, but they're all just well worth experiencing. It's something totally different. Now in 2017, if you ever had doubted that bosses kind of bounced back from the early 2000s, then look no further than Cuphead. This indie game boils down gameplay to its super basics. You just run, jump, and shoot. That's it. It delivers some of the most wildly creative bosses in video game history. They're all hand-drawn, by the way, and it makes them look effortless. This is a game that's just wall-to-wall bosses, with only short run-and-gun sections, briefly sometimes breaking up the action. The main focus is the bosses, and they're all incredible. The DLC ones are also underrated, but one of the fan favorites is probably King Dice. He's a dice-headed gambler with his own rogues gallery. This is a boss rush that doesn't reuse any boss assets. Like, all the bosses here are brand new. You'll fight martini glasses, cigars and ashtrays, stacks of casino chips, and a bunch of other stuff. It's an entire game's worth of beautifully animated monsters, all in a single boss fight. This game is so over the top and a work of art at the same time, and also hard as hell and fun. Also in 2017, Resident Evil 7, which reintroduced a weary world to the beauty of a good Capcom boss fight, and managed to do the impossible: make a first-person boss fight actually fun. Each encounter with the insane Jack Baker ups the ante in wonderfully over-the-top ways. Your first fight against Jack in the garage has you driving a car in circles, smashing into him and everything else, while he just kind of laughs at you like a crazy man. The second encounter goes full Evil Dead, as you duel Jack with a chainsaw. Horror games rarely had gameplay, much less boss fights like this in the 2010s, so getting to actually engage your stalker and defeat them was incredibly refreshing. Resident Evil 7 also announced the return of Capcom after many years of mistakes and slip-ups and bad business decisions. So Resident Evil has really been riding high ever since, and the Baker family fights were so cool. And in 2018, the God of War reboot is surprisingly light on boss battles. The sequel, God of War Ragnarok, definitely goes pretty big on reversing that, but God of War starts strong with the iconic battle against the Stranger right at the start. This mysterious, threatening character appears outside of this reformed Kratos' home, and then we get a very different, bombastic fight compared to the previous games in the series. Like in God of War 3, Kratos swung around on a mountain-sized titan while fighting gods in Olympus. This Kratos is older and wiser and has something to lose, but thankfully it kind of just becomes a big old Dragon Ball Z fight. It's freaking sick. It's a more intimate version of the big budget God of War boss from the old days, and it's arguably more tense, emotional, and foreboding because of it. This is a perfect reintroduction to the badassery of Kratos, and to a new universe where the little details really matter more than ever here. Next up, bosses caused controversy in 2019's Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. The final boss of the game is Sword Saint Ishin, and at the time, he was seen as the most difficult fight in video games. There's a good reason for that. This guy does not mess around. He's one of the most aggressive bosses on our list. Like, he unleashes a series of insane attacks that you just kind of need to memorize if you want to survive. He has multiple phases, because of course he does, and then beating him is like a badge of honor, even for hardcore fans of From Software. The creators of Dark Souls dropped the hardest boss ever in our laps, but they didn't stop there. Future bosses by the same developers would push players even harder. In 2019, Ishin would have easily topped a list of toughest video game bosses. We probably talked about him, but now, I don't know if he'd make the top 5. It's only gotten crazier. Boss fights in video games are gonna explode in popularity from here on out in 2019, and they're only gonna get more difficult. But jump into 2020, very quickly, we need to talk about the fight against Ellie in Last of Us Part 2. After swapping into the role of the revenge-seeking Abby, you'll actually have to fight Ellie yourself, the person you've been playing as for hours and hours at this point. And this is kind of another fight in the style of Mr. Freeze, except Ellie is hunting you, so you'll have to dodge traps and avoid getting ambushed in the way you would do previously to, enemy characters. It's a very tense and pretty cool sequence. No matter how you feel about the game, this is a creative boss that just shows how cinematic story games can include clever boss fights. Jumping to 2021, Doom Eternal. It's proof positive that many modern games respect their players. Maybe too much, because Doom Eternal has gameplay that'll melt your fingers and make you go cross-eyed. It can get insane, especially if you ramp up the difficulty and you really get fast. The game throws enemies at you that move like they're stuck on fast forward, and the combat challenges only get more eye-wateringly difficult as you progress. I think I actually burnt out a whole computer mouse on this game. The DLC pushed the envelope even harder with a truly diabolical final boss. This is the Dark Lord. He's essentially the devil of Doom Eternal lore, and he's decided to steal all your powers for himself. So in this kind of blister-inducing boss fight, he can heal himself by damaging you. This battle can technically last forever if you're not dodging his attacks and dealing damage to him fast enough. That healing gimmick is brutal enough, but then the game lets this guy spawn mini cyber demons and other boss level monsters into his pretty small arena. The skill ceiling on this game is so high, it's really no surprise that Doom the Dark Ages' difficulty can only go down after the Dark Lord boss fight. It's insane. I know not everybody played the Ancient Gods Part 2, but they really pushed it there. Now in 2022, Elden Ring. Of course, it dropped the Dark Souls formula into a massive open world map and turned hardcore boss fights into mainstream video game stuff. The popularity of Elden Ring and the explosion of boss fights in games cannot be overstated. Bosses were always big, but after Elden Ring, even mainstream AAA big budget games are gonna have hardcore boss battles. The influence has stuck. Maybe it's because so many people talked about Millennia, the standard, which all other tough bosses are judged at this point. She heals herself by attacking you. She has incredibly difficult and iconic combo attacks and spreads the worst poison in the game. She can infect you with scarlet rot, the red stuff. It's the worst poison in the game. It sucks. And then on top of that, she's just extremely powerful. The only upside, I guess, if you're looking at it for one, is that she doesn't have a lot of health compared to some places. That actually matters when she's using your Mimic Tear to heal herself. She was insane for a reason, and just people beating this boss went viral for a reason. It really stuck in the video game culture. And with that, we might as well jump ahead to 2024's Shadow of the Erdtree, because the boss we talked about before, she's totally optional. You never actually have to fight her. She's also technically easy compared to FromSoft's boss masterpiece in Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. Radahn is the final boss of the expansion. He's back, and this is genuinely still one of the toughest bosses in video game history. Radahn, consort of Miquella, is almost indescribable here. The fight is just this chaotic mess of massive sword attacks, holy power raining from the sky, and just dozens and dozens and dozens of deaths. Somehow, it didn't take us that many tries to beat him, but in our hearts, we just knew that we got lucky. There's only one boss on our list that's tougher, and everyone will know exactly what we're talking about. Jumping over to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, this game takes us full circle, back to the epic JRPG bosses of 1997 that we mentioned earlier, and it reinvents those basic battle screens for the big budget AAA market. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth just gives you full control over the epic moments that we imagined as kids. At the end of the game, your party goes all out against the kind of JRPG super boss that never made a lick of sense. So Sephiroth Reborn is a towering mutant with multiple phases your party has to take one step at a time. It's a kind of overcomplicated boss with lots of weak points and super attacks that JRPGs just love to roll out at the end. Except this time you're physically there, actually attacking in real time and dodging attacks. It's the most lavish realization of the fantasy part of Final Fantasy, and we're very eager to see what Square Enix can do from here. Can boss battles become more ridiculous, more climactic? How much more money can one company waste on a boss battle? We don't know, but we'd love to see.
Nothing personal.
Also in 2024, we had 9 Souls. This takes the Sekiro parry and demands absolute perfection to defeat the game's final boss. The secret final phase of Aigong leads to the true ending, and she is brutally difficult in a way the other bosses aren't. You can cheese some FromSoft bosses. You can call in an expert to help you against Radahn, you know? Like, there are strategies and tricks for almost every boss on this list, but 9 Souls doesn't have any of that. The final boss is practically a rhythm game on extreme, and you need to hit those notes perfectly to keep your stamina up and survive. Because the boss, she attacks in like these long, complicated streams of attacks and mixes things up with special attacks that can only be deflected with an unbounded counter, which is performed by charging parry briefly before releasing. So it's really complex. It isn't enough for this game to just demand perfect parries. You'll also need to throw off your rhythm with a special alternate parry. It's the hardest boss on our list, and if you've beaten the true ending like we did, we salute you, man. Now to 2025, Hollow Knight Silksong. This is the current weather vane for boss difficulty. This Metroidvania is conventionally difficult with challenging traditional bosses, but like it also uses the format to screw us in like the cruelest ways possible. Grawl the Great is just twisted sicko stuff, man. Like the boss isn't even that tough. It's everything surrounding him. He's located at the top of an extremely difficult platforming path. Leading to an enemy rush. And then finally the boss himself. This boss lives in a swampy bog with an awful status effect that blocks you from healing, so this sucks so bad. That long path to reach him has a fake out save point along the way. It's actually a trap. There is a real save point that's closer to the boss arena, but it's very hidden and easy to miss. This is the kind of evil game design we're talking about here. Silksong uses every tool in the toolbox just to give us a bad day. Silksong is another boss-heavy game in a year full of boss-heavy games. 2025 is obsessed with boss fights. You had real stinkers like Black Ops 7 going viral for that bad campaign moment where you fight a giant guy. To the indie total chaos. Or Look Outside that had some incredible battles. And Death Stranding 2 and the big fight with Higgs. It feels like going through this whole thing, like these years and years of boss battles, it feels like 2025 and beyond might be on a good run. Hopefully we can keep up this momentum because boss battles are really the end-all be-all. But I've probably talked enough at this point about boss battles, man, so if you've stuck with me, thanks for hanging out. I would love to know some of your favorite boss battles. Not recently, like, give me an old one. If you're an older gamer like we are, you know, if you were playing in the 90s, the 80s, the early 2000s, hit us with a boss you really like that we didn't mention here, because we could always make more of these types of videos. But this has been a fun way to talk through the evolution of time and boss battles, so if you like this video, clicking the like button helps us. We appreciate that, but that's all we really got for you today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time. I gotta go take a nap.